It is my honor to introduce Candace Rondeaux as this year's speaker at the annual Ron Clifton Lecture in American Studies. First of all, who was Ron Clifton? There are only a couple of people in this room who know who he is and who he was and who knew him. First of all, why did Salzburg Global in 2018 establish the Ron Clifton Lecture in American Studies? Well, the reason is because, in a nutshell, it was in recognition of his many contributions to Salzburg Global over 25 years. There's actually a former lecturer in American, Ron Clifton lecturer here with us. Where's Reinhardt? Reinhardt, there he is. Yeah, Reinhardt was also a former lecturer for Ron Clifton Lecture. Anyway, a couple of words about Ron, just so you know why we're celebrating this. He served for 25 years as a Senior Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Department of State, with postings in Calcutta, New Delhi, Tunis, Dublin, Brussels, London, and Washington, D.C. In 1992, this is really important, Ron was responsible for brokering a $9 million grant from the United States Information Agency, USIS, to the Salzburg Global Seminar to create the American Studies Center. Wow, this was big news. He served as the center's founder and director from 1994 to 1996 and played an important role in the series of 32 American Studies Center symposia funded by USAA from 1992 until 2003. Well, in 2003, when the USAA funding came to an end, as funding always does, Ron Clifton was very influential in founding the Salzburg Seminar American Studies Association, SASA, making this establishment and continuation of SASA his main professional interest. So from 2003 to 2018, Ron designed and implemented 32 American Studies symposia on American Studies themes, including politics, literature, cultural studies, and history. In retrospect, it was an honor and a privilege for me to work with Ron on American Studies programs from 1993 until 2018. I am certain that if Ron were here today, he would heartily welcome Candace Rondeaux as this year's speaker. Her work as Senior Director, Future Frontlines program at New America dovetails with many of the issues Ron cared strongly about. New America is dedicated to realizing the promise of America in an era of rapid technological change. Ron was instrumental, as some of you know, in leading Salzburg Global's introduction to the internet in the 1990s. This was a big deal. Nobody knew what the hell was going on except Ron. So he would be very happy to know of Candace's work in finding solutions to problems posed by digitalization. Candace, as you have perhaps read, is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who contributes regularly to the Financial Times, and she served as the South Asia Bureau Chief for Washington Post. Well, with her distinguished background, she is amazingly qualified and eminently qualified to be this year's Ron Clifton speaker. I know that we all look forward to her remarks. So, without further ado, please help me to welcome Candace Rondeaux.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you for that very warm introduction. And thank you, Charles, and to the whole Salzburg Global team for inviting me here again. I can't believe it's been just like 3 years since I was last here. And so much has changed since then. So it's good to be back. I do kind of consider this my home, so thank you for the welcome. And it's also good to be here to honor Ron Clifton's legacy of public diplomacy and a really extraordinary record of promoting America in the world and an America that is engaged in the world and a world that is engaging with America. Something that I think we're now seeing kind of unfold in a different way than we would have expected 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm honored to be here to talk a little bit about some of those changes. we've been talking for the last 24 hours or so, and I know some of you a little bit longer while you've been here, about some pretty big questions. And we've been wrestling with this debate over political violence, not only at home, but in the world, and the way it's kind of polarizing us. And we've been witnessing something I think we're all kind of worried about, which is a change in how democracy actually works, both, again, at home and abroad. And I think it's sort of it's prompted us to ask some questions about whether the American experiment is over. Whether this American century that Henry Luce used to talk about, back in 1941, when we were in a very different position in the world, is at its end. How much of what we were experiencing in terms of our democracy is really about our decline, and what does it all mean? If America is autocratic or less democratic and more isolationist, in this world order that we're seeing shift so rapidly, what does that mean, not just 10 years from now, but a generation from now? I guess I want to try and unpack a little bit what it might look like. Like a lot of you in this room, I've spent a lot of time, and I'm afraid to say I'm now at the midway point in life where I can talk about decades, not years, which is super scary. I've been trying to answer some of these questions for a really long time. Some of you are involved in criminal justice. Some of you are involved in media. I've actually been involved in both of those things for a long time. And that work has taken me from crime scenes to war zones and to think tanks and classrooms, where I'm trying to kind of share what I've learned with the next generation. And it's been a pretty interesting journey. And of course, I have to use these notes. Charles said it had to be informal, but it's a lecture, people. So I got to have notes. And I guess what I've learned about these questions is that about America's place in the world and whether it's changing irrevocably, whether the social contract is totally broken, is that all of these questions kind of circle around this fundamental challenge that we're experiencing in America, but I think other nations are too, which is we're trying to navigate a world where a lot of the assumptions that guided us just don't hold anymore. The things that we thought were true are not true. The tools we thought were going to tell us about the truth also don't seem to be doing that. And in a lot of ways, I guess that's what brings us here together today and over this last couple days. I guess my search really began in Chicago, which is where I grew up. I was born and raised there. On the south side and north side, and yes, I am a Cubs fan. I'm just going to say it out loud. I grew up. Another not so shocking fact, or maybe somewhat shocking, is I'm mixed race. My mom is black. My dad was white. I'm sorry, my mom is white. My mom is black. Straight. Now I got to get it straight. And that fact of being mixed race when I was coming up in Chicago kind of defined, I guess, my worldview, or at least shaped my worldview. It was a time in the 70s, now I'm totally dating myself, when the city was going through a pretty wrenching drama over busing and desegregation of schools. And I remember I was about 6 years old. I guess I was probably in first grade. And this is on the south side of Chicago. And I was walking home after school. I was by myself for once. Usually I had somebody, I was walking home with. And I came on this corner that was like just a few blocks from my house. And there were this kind of clumps of kids on the corner. One group of white kids on one side and one group of black kids on the other side. And I was like, what's going on here? And somebody said, well, this is a tradition. We, every school year on the first day of school, we line up and we fight each other to see, who's going to be in control of the school, black kids or white kids. And I was like, what the hell is that about? I don't even know if I said that, but, I was like, wow. And I just kind of froze. And because I was like, what side am I supposed to be on here? And in fact, somebody asked me that, like, which side are you going to be on? And I was like, I don't think I can be on either side. And it was in that moment, I really remember it very poignantly, thinking about my mom, thinking about what she would think if I joined a side, thinking about my friends, what they would think if I joined a side. And I didn't join a side, I just kind of ran away. And I guess I just kind of chose not to choose in a way, and I became a bookworm. That was kind of my refuge. And my mom was a single mom. She was a teacher, raising me on a teacher's salary. And so, like a lot of kids, I was a latchkey kid. I know a lot of latchkey kids are probably in this room. You'll remember being raised by like Fantasy Island and The Love Boat. And for me, that's Guiding Light, there you go. Yeah, I mean, TV was kind of like your babysitter and your friend, but for me, it was kind of a choice between, the couch and TV and the library. That's kind of where I ended up. And so I split my time between the two, watching like old Columbo reruns and stuff, and haunting the true crime section of the library. And I can't even tell you why, except that the other thing that was going on in my life is that my uncle, who was kind of like my father figure, he was a cop, actually, and he was a crime scene investigator. And every once in a while, he's a very stoic guy, he would come home, and these stories would kind of tumble out of him about some of the things that he had seen and experienced. And my uncle was a white guy who had very different ideas about the world. And some of the things that we've been talking about here about sort of policing and, violence and justice kind of played out at the dinner table for me. And I guess maybe that's why I kept going back to this true crime section, which, by the way, in the Dewey Decimal System is 364.15. I still have that memorized. And it's kind of there that I started like wandering the aisles, and I encountered this one book. It was The Onion Fields, and I don't know if anybody's read that. Totally obscure, unless you're a crime reporter, you probably don't care. But it was a story, it was written by an LA cop who had, while he was on the job, experienced two cops on the police force that were taken hostage and eventually killed. And it was a really gripping story. And I kind of almost imagined my uncle going through something like that. And I had a lot of these kind of mixed feelings and sympathies. And then the next book that was really influential from the 364 section was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I hear a lot of in here. So you probably have read it. If you haven't, you probably saw the movie, which was pretty good. And it's a story that also spoke to me because it was a crime that had happened in the middle of America, in the middle of the century, at a time when people kind of thought about violence very differently. And it really exposed a lot about the relationship between America's sense of itself and security and justice. And these were stories that really spoke to me. I don't know why. I guess because violence was so prevalent in Chicago at that time. And it had all kinds of motivations. Some of it was racial, some of it was organized crime, some of it was gang violence. But I just was puzzled by it all the time. And it was that obsession and a lot of reading Harriet the Spy and Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew that kind of made me want to solve puzzles using storytelling and kind of uncover some hidden things using truth-telling to kind of get at what sometimes we can't see. So let's just fast forward to high school. We don't need a whole life story here, but I'll just go through quickly. The other thing that my mother did really well was game the system. So she was a teacher, and she figured out if we moved to right zip code, a lot of people have had this experience, you can get to a good school. And the good school I went to happened to offer a program that taught hard languages and social studies together. It was called the Academy in the Academy. And the year that I entered, the hard language that was being taught was Russian, of all things. And it was an interesting time to be learning Russian. This is 1980s, so again, dating myself. Cold War was still going on. We had Star Wars. We had Ronald Reagan, and there was this looming fear always of nuclear war, a looming fear of a clash with Russia. This has been, I think, the defining feature of American international relations, America's place in the world, for most of my life, and probably most of yours as well, even though we sometimes forget that. But for me, it was very resonant. Guess what? I totally bombed at learning Russian. Like I kept getting Fs because I was a really hormonal teenager who could not focus. I had my mind on other things. I don't want to talk about what those are. That'll be off the record. But still, like the idea of speaking Russian and like this totally kind of secret language that was the language of the enemy, I found that super intriguing. And this idea that I could be this black girl, this like mixed race girl, and had this party trick where I could like be like, yo, I speak this funny language. I always was kind of enamored of that. And then college happened, or it really didn't happen actually. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. Again, going to date myself here. It's 1988. And I didn't stay very long because I got caught up in a controversy on campus where, again, race and the divisions that we wrestle with at home started to really assert themselves. There was a slave auction at a fraternity that was quite famous that was in blackface. And I learned about this through a colleague of mine. That's a long story. We might need some glasses of wine to talk about it. But the long upshot is essentially this fraternity held this slave auction in blackface. They sold Oprah on the auction block. They sold Michael Jackson. And these were the heroes, right, of Black America in the 1980s, and really, frankly, the crossover heroes of white America, too. So it was really kind of a stunning moment. And so some friends and I, just 8 of us, and all mixed, white kids and black kids, went down, we chained ourselves to the bench in front of this fraternity. And it was peaceful. It was like a peaceful protest. We sort of did a little die-in, and then the cops came and they took us away. And the university wasn't very happy about that. And nor were a lot of other people. And it got a lot of national headlines, so much so that the phone was ringing off the hook. We got a lot of hate mail. Suddenly, the whole world of going to college was kind of turned upside down. And so I did what a lot of people do. I dropped out. This is super personal, right? It's like, whoa, shit. And I guess I dropped out with this idea that I would like run away. Again, just kind of running away from the frictions of race in the country. And like all sort of teenage wannabe writers, the first thing I thought was like, I'm going to go to Europe. I'm going to hitchhike. I'm going to backpack. I'm going to do all these things. I had like $300. I had no plan. And back then they had something called Air Hitch, where you would like, sign up. You'd be like, oh, I'm going to go to these 3 cities. I don't care which one, just, as long as I can get there for $100. So I ended up in Madrid, actually, so Spain, basically. And I ran out of money really quick because $300 doesn't really take you very long, doesn't take you very far. And I kind of stumbled into Morocco, where I spent a lot of time because it's cheaper to live there. So I lived on tea and toast. And the other thing I lived on was the literature of resistance and exile in America, which was really influential also in my life, like some of the other books that kind of brought the idea of storytelling to life. So that included James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. Some of you probably have read that. Malcolm X's autobiography. And interestingly, Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Langston Hughes and the Big Sea. And I got these books actually, I went into town, I sold my watch because I was totally out of money. But what I wanted was not to be bored, and I wanted to be stimulated, and I wanted to read these books. I didn't care about how much tea or toast I could have. And I devoured it. These were like my field manual for like how to live, how to be part of the resistance, how to be outside of America, and look at it from afar. And you had like Baldwin writing about the experience of being Black in America from Paris. You had Malcolm X describing what it was like to go from being Malcolm Little of Detroit to Malik al-Shabazz of Mecca. And that transformation was something that really spoke to me, but also Hemingway, where you had these sort of experiences and For Whom the Bell Tolls of people going to war and fighting for ideals that actually don't really add up. And that really touched me. And also Hughes, and sort of traveling abroad to France and then on to Africa and looking for artistic community. Each of these authors really, really resonated with me. And the other thing that resonated with me, somebody talked about this, I think it was Eric, I'm going to call him out right now, about being an anti-racist, anti-skinhead punk. And I guess I count myself as one of those folks. So shout out. But the other thing that was really influential at that time, not just punk, but also hip hop, which really was speaking to the challenges of race in America. And both of these forms of music were really sort of like built on questioning authority. And somehow, again, because I was abroad, because I was so far away, that idea of resistance really resonated with me. And I guess, at some point I kind of counted myself as an anarchist, pretty radical. And I also, of course, read Marx and all the things that you read when you think you're going to be a radical. I was intrigued also by the Soviet experiment because it was still kind of going on, although the wall was about to come down in East Berlin, and we were going to learn sort of what comes after that. But I guess ultimately it was all those things that kind of led me kind of back to myself and back to America. I was in London. I kind of washed up there after a lot of travel, and I was a coat check girl at a theater in Piccadilly Circus, and I was living in a squat in a council flat in Highgate, because again, that's what you did. And I remember there was like this little small TV in the back at work, and I remember seeing the LA riots like unfolding on the screen, and I was like, man, I got to get home, because once again, this thing that had been so pivotal in shaping my life and so many other lives in America, not just Black lives, white lives, everybody's life, was popping off. And I felt like I was missing something. So I went home. I did not go back to school immediately. I joined ACT UP and got involved in, the AIDS movement. And I also got involved in the environmental movement. I spent time in British Columbia running up and down a cut block of redwood forest trees, getting arrested, getting in all kinds of trouble. And at the same time, those arrests kind of also opened my eyes again to the way justice in America and justice for people of color is just experienced so differently. And I knew that, I could see and I could feel, the weight of that sometimes when I was on the front line at some of these protests, and the way my body was treated differently than other bodies. And I guess that's kind of maybe what propelled me to begin looking for kind of a new sword and shield, something else, some other way to bear witness. And maybe that's how I stumbled into journalism, I guess. A few years later, you need to get all the details off the record after some drinks. I started my reporting career, and it really began quite literally with a bang. I went to NYU J School. This is 2000 when I started, and I got an internship at the New York Daily News with the investigative team. I was super psyched. And my second day on the job was September 11th, 2001. And I really, some of you probably were in New York or Washington. You kind of have memories of your own. I'm sure maybe some of this will resonate with you. But what I remember about that day was exactly what everybody remembers. It was a clear blue sky. You couldn't imagine anything going wrong, but it did. And I was on my way to the Daily News, and the favorite guy at the bagel shop was like, "Hey, did you see what happened? Are you covering that?" I was like, "What happened?" I had no idea because I was cut off. And at this time, by the way, there were no cell phones. It wasn't like everybody had a cell phone. I certainly didn't have one. And so when I surfaced on the subway, I got upstairs. It was 6th Avenue, and I remember looking up at the Fox News ticker, if you've ever seen that, and it's like this big sort of red scrawl, and it was like America under attack, and the whole of Manhattan was looking up and down south to the World Trade Center, these plumes of smoke just coming up. And I kind of count that day as the day that America started to unravel. The day when we had to confront the crisis of how the world saw us again. And we hadn't had a day like that really since Pearl Harbor. And in some ways, that experience has accounted for, I think, some of the the things that we're grappling with here together as we talk to each other about violence and political violence and the state of our democracy. On the one hand, at that time, you'll remember this, there were freedom fries that happened. And we also found that the world was with us. It might have been the last time that the world was with us as Americans. Europe joined us, NATO joined us, George Bush said we were going to Afghanistan, and everybody followed. And then this other thing happened, this kind of paranoia set in, about Islam and about the Muslim world and about these dark people who were challenging our primacy in the world. And that's what led us to Guantanamo. It's what led us to Bagram, where we justified the use of torture, and we ended up mired in the Middle East for 2 decades. Before I get into all that, I just want to tell you sort of the journey that preceded kind of figuring out what that meant on the ground. I went on to cover cops and courts in Florida after that for the St. Petersburg Times, and later went on to Maryland and Virginia, where I worked for the Washington Post doing the same thing, cops and crimes, crisis. And one of the things I covered was Hurricane Katrina. Somebody mentioned that earlier here also, and how that was one of the other moments when we realized, no, this is not working. This experiment that we're talking about, democracy, equal rights, all that stuff, this is not working. It's not looking good. And another moment, I think, was Virginia Tech, and I covered that as well, and the massacre that really marked out sort of mass shootings as this kind of pandemic in America. And I think still to this day, it rates as the number 1 or number 2 mass shooting in our history. So I learned a lot about violence, kept thinking about it. And the other thing I did was cover executions in Virginia. And I learned that it takes 18 Hail Marys to go from the visitor center to the actual death house, because I said them for the first time in my life, because I found that this was an experience that kind of rocks you to the core, going to see justice delivered by the state in this way. And Virginia, by the way, you probably all know this, next to Texas, has the highest rate of capital executions in the country historically. So covering the death house was truly experience. The other thing I learned was that under Virginia law, it turns out that executions have to be held with regular old citizens who are bearing witness. And so the system is that about 6 people will volunteer to go to witness every execution in Virginia. I had no idea until I went into the visitor's room. I was like, oh, those people have different colored name tags. That's weird. So what's that about? And it turned out that these people, some of them were, older guys who had been coming down to the death house for, a couple decades. Some were young. There was a young woman, actually, who was an Iraq war vet. She just went because she just wanted to see justice delivered. So again, just sort of wrestling with this. And those years were kind of my training wheels for what I later experienced as a reporter for the Washington Post in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I went there in 2008 after Benazir Bhutto, the prime minister of Pakistan, was assassinated. I came about 2 months after she was killed, and the whole country was just on fire. There's no other way to describe it. If there wasn't a suicide bombing, there was a drone attack. If there wasn't a drone attack, there was a mass protest. If there wasn't that, there was a confrontation over the future of the country. And next door in Afghanistan, this whole other thing was unfolding that most of America had forgotten, right? We were already now 7 years into that war, and it was already the forgotten war. And I arrived there in Afghanistan, a place that really, still to this day, very much touches me. And I saw what the Soviets had left behind, and this legacy of just sort of destruction. But the other thing they left behind was a lot of Afghans who could speak Russian. People who were generals and colonels and, policemen in the military that we were somehow, the United States, trying to retrain to do things on our behalf. And listening to them and their stories for me was also transformative because they had a lot of memories about the last superpower that tried that trick. And they had a lot of warnings for how that would turn out for us. And as you know, it turned out just that way. So there's a lot to unpack here. I don't want to talk for too much longer, but I do want to talk a little bit about how all of those experiences kind of led me to the last thing I've been kind of obsessed with, which some of you know is looking at the Wagner Group. If you don't know what the Wagner Group is, if you haven't heard of them, you might have heard about this moment in June of 2023 when a bunch of guys hopped into tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and they rolled from eastern Ukraine across the border into Rostov-on-Don, and all the way up to Moscow, very close to Moscow. And it was the first time in Russia's history that somebody had attempted to breach Moscow like that since Adolf Hitler in World War II. Most people were not paying attention until that moment to what the Wagner Group was, but I had, because the guy who was behind it, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was a guy who had spent his life in sort of the criminal underground of St. Petersburg, the very same place that I ended up doing a year of exchange in the 1990s. And in fact, literally like in the same block. We practically lived cheek by jowl while I was there, but I didn't know it. Also, Vladimir Putin was deputy mayor at the time. Didn't know that then. Too busy drinking vodka, doing things, hanging out. But that experience kind of came back to me when in 2016, there were these rumors about Russian interference in our elections. And you guys will definitely remember that. You'll remember the troll farms and the way these sock puppets, these fake accounts on Facebook and Twitter were used to influence public opinion in the United States, not only just against Hillary Clinton and for Donald Trump, but just for the whole idea that elections were safe, that are vehicles for democracy. And the person behind that, Yevgeny Prigozhin. And I recognized in that moment, 2017, and then later 2018, oh man, this is our chickens coming home to roost. And this guy, nobody knows what the hell he's doing. He's running some sort of ghost army, and then he's got this ghost army online. And nobody knew how to unpack it or describe it. You had these headlines about, Putin says that they're not ours, Internet Research Agency. No, we didn't do that. And I was really frustrated by that because I knew better. I had spent enough time in Russia, on looking at Russia and the world, looking at our relationship with Russia, to know that there was another side of the story. And so for the last 7 years, with my colleagues at Arizona State University and New America, I spent all this time kind of trying to unravel that and what it looks like. And what it turns out to look like is a lot like the Taliban, a lot like Al-Qaeda. It's a networked organization that has an ideology. It's not just a group of mercenaries. And that ideology is based on white supremacy and the supremacy of the Russian people over their neighbors. Something I really also recognize, and I hope some people in this room, I think some people in this room already do recognize, the way that assertion of empire, whether it's American or Russian, has played out in our world system over the last 80 years, basically. A lot of what I learned came from looking at technology differently. And I guess that's kind of where the geeky part comes in, more geek stuff. And the way that the internet is both a tool for, networked activity and social movements, but it also can do a lot to reveal what that looks like and who's behind it. And so fast forward to around summer of 2018, I found myself in a London hotel conference room in a basement. It was really dank and dark. And I'm sitting in this room with a bunch of strangers, and I have no idea who they are. Nobody's saying their names. It's really weird. And I'd gone there for a training by Bellingcat. And some of you may have heard of Bellingcat. It's a research organization that uses computer science, really, and computer forensics and open source information, publicly available data, to uncover sort of the hidden networks behind autocracy. Most famously, some of you will remember that MH17, the Malaysia jetliner that was shot down over Ukraine in the summer of 2014, it was Bellingcat that really kind of unpacked that using basically Google, and using collective action to uncover what happened there, the thing that Russia denied, that basically sent us into the war that we are now experiencing today. And that moment in that little London basement was really revelatory. It was a little bit like being, I don't know, kind of in this dark world where people do all kinds of crazy stuff to each other online. I was going to say the bad word. Including, most importantly, one thing that kind of stuck with me was a beheading that the Wagner Group was ultimately responsible for, that they taped online. And it was a beheading using a sledgehammer, hence the name of my book, Putin's Sledgehammer, against an unarmed Syrian man at a gas plant that Russia was trying to take over in Syria. And that kind of began my journey into looking at the way networked organizations that are sort of separated in time and space use the internet, use technology to both strengthen their power and their influence, but also hide the nature of that influence, which is something I think, again, when we're thinking about political violence and we're thinking about autocracy, is something that we're really wrestling with. And the truth is, we're not the only ones who are actually, reckoning with these contradictions. So it turns out Russia's dealing with it, Iran's dealing with it, Europe is dealing with it. This digital transformation is challenging our institutions, challenging what we think about the truth, challenging our sense of power. It's in some ways giving us a sense, because when we post something online on Twitter or whatever, sorry, I know it's X now, that we're powerful when we put people down, publicly. We're powerful when we threaten people online, and that's the culture that we're living with now. In some ways, that is one of the challenges of this century that we still have to deal with, and it is one reason why I think it is one answer to the question as to why we see democracy declining, is because we haven't really figured out how to deal with the power of that technology to transform human thought, to transform the idea of justice and fairness. And I guess the reason we haven't is because some of the things you've been talking about here, which is the way the media just doesn't work the way it should. I know that there was some discussion about, accountability for the media. I would say the media actually has plenty of accountability, especially now. We're seeing it play out, people being fired for saying things in public, for, challenging what's happening. But what's missing from the kind of legacy media is creative thinking about digital technology and the way it can enable you to uncover things. If you just figure out, if you can triangulate and geolocate where something is happening, and figure out who was there at the same time, it's a pretty powerful tool, I've learned. And I've spent a lot of time documenting war crimes. I spent a lot of time looking at the way those tools can be used in the case of January 6th and the Capitol riots. My colleagues and I at ASU, some of them are computer scientists and some are historians and some are linguists. We've spent a lot of time deconstructing Parler, which is this platform that became very popular with the far right in the United States, and where much of the Capitol riot was planned openly. And we found a few things there. One, we found that the vast majority of congressional Republicans that challenged the legitimacy of the vote in 2021 were also very present on Parler, and many of them were benefiting from the activity of bots, many of which probably were Russian. Now, I'm not saying it's all a big Russian conspiracy, because they all had their own thing going. But what I am saying is What journalism can do differently today is take these tools of digital forensics much more seriously than they do, and take the idea of democratizing access to information and showing your work and evidence, and elevating that as a new kind of value for journalism. Because when we do that, we really reveal a lot of the complex patterns that we see out there in the world. And we can see pretty clearly that the institutions that we've relied on for so long, the UN, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, all these big international bodies that have been kind of part of the world of international affairs, at least for the last 50 years or more, they're just not really built for speed. And neither is Congress. I mean, almost none of our institutions are built for speed, including, I would add, the legacy media. And we need to get to this point where we can start to respond with agility to the challenges that we're seeing. And I wager that the way to do that is not just media literacy. That's nice. But teaching people how to deconstruct the truth themselves, giving them the tools to do that, is really critical, making them active participants in the business of generating information and sharing information and exposing abuses of power. That is, to me, the work. And the other thing I guess I've learned along the way, because now I teach, and that's pretty interesting, pretty eye-opening, is that I guess, a lot of folks who are younger, and now I'm really being one of those old people, they have a lot of distrust for these institutions for the very things I'm just talking about, but they're also living a life where they're encumbered by student debt. They're working low-wage jobs. They're living in their parents' house longer. They're cut off from opportunity. And they're asking really hard questions that I think we're kind of duty-bound to answer, which is, why are we spending all this money abroad? What is it getting us when our democracy looks so fragile right now? What's the trade-off here? It's kind of a guns versus butter dilemma that America hasn't had to wrestle with probably since World War II, really. And that's kind of a scary thing to think about. A lot of them grew up with this financial crisis in the shadow of that, the pandemic, and they're asking really hard questions about the future. And we got to hear them, These are not isolationist questions. These are questions about accountability for what government does in the name of Americans, both at home and abroad. This is about the mismatch between democracy and exporting democracy and how we're living at home. And that's why we find ourselves at the end of, I suppose, this unipolar moment that we've enjoyed for so long. We know for sure now it's over. We know that because we're not the exception anymore. We know that because what we're experiencing at home right now is something that looks a lot like what Russians are experiencing too, Iranians are experiencing too. The people that we have demonized, right, in the name of democracy, they're having the same problems that we're having, it turns out. And I guess those are the lessons I've learned in this, I hope, short lifetime from how power travels with violence in the world and what we need to do about it. So thank you.